back again with another Indian content.
It's a boy calling.
Yeah, it's Black Faris.
And it's your girl D.
Ugo. So we're back with another video.
Ugo.
Yes.
Off you go.
This is
Stop that. It's really funny.
Stop that. It's HUG.
okay. Today's videos is Indian vs China. Who will win? Military.
Okay.
Military conversation.
Comparison. Yeah.
Let's see.
In mid-June 2020, World War III started trending on Twitter. Again, this time it was because a border dispute in the Himalayas between Chinese and Indian forces turned deadly, killing upward of 20 people. This is the first time since 1975 that the two countries have had a fatal conflict, and the most serious skirmish since 1967. Naturally, as the two nations are populous, militarily powerful, and have nuclear capabilities, the world is biting its nails to see what happens next. But assuming the whole thing doesn't end in diplomacy or a world-consuming mushroom cloud, which country has what it takes to bring home a final victory? Using a mix of historical precedents of the prior conflicts between the two countries and our knowledge of their current military capabilities, we intend to find out exactly whether China or India would win if the two nations went to war today. After all, we're not just talking about dusty hypotheticals here. Relations between India and China have been extremely strained since the Sino-Indian War of 1962, which occurred over the same stretch of the Himalayan border that's causing conflicts today. India had granted the Dalai Lama asylum within their borders after the fallout of the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, already putting them in China's bad books. And with China's military encroaching on the line of actual control, the demarcation line that separates Indian and Chinese territory in the Himalayas, a military skirmish was practically inevitable. The resulting conflict was short-lived, lasting only 1 month and 1 day between October and November of 1962. The People's Liberation Army of China had a vast numerical superiority over India's military forces, and India suffered significantly greater losses, with nearly double China's deaths, many wounded and over 3,000 captured. This loss is partly chalked up to the fact that it's believed, according to some leaked CIA documents, that India underestimated both China's military capabilities and their willingness to escalate the conflict. While India requested military assistance from the US in the form of 12 squadrons of fighter jets, their pleas were rejected, and India instead turned to Moscow for assistance. Ultimately, none of it did all that much good, as China claimed the eastern theater up to the line of actual control before declaring a unilateral ceasefire. India was left to lick its wounds, and tensions between the two countries have been high ever since, with conflicts still breaking out well into the 70s. Both nations have ramped up militarization around the line of actual control as a show of strength, and this has left both with very little room to maneuver. In a sense, the Himalayan border is a military powder keg. And lately, we've been seeing the sparks. While a past record of military supremacy definitely works in China's favor, the Sino-Indian War was also 58 years ago, and failure is an excellent teacher. India has been engaged in frequent conflicts since the Sino-Indian War, giving their combatants invaluable battlefield experience. India is widely believed to have won every conflict they engaged in post-Sino-Indian War, with the exception of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, which ended in a ceasefire. China comparatively fought its last considerable conflict against Vietnamese forces in 1979. Once again, experience won out here, as the Vietnamese, who recently honed their skills in battle against the forces of the United States, are largely considered to have handed China's asses to them. This is why the value of actual experience in war can never be overstated. But let's take a step back and look at what these two militaries have to offer in terms of manpower, technology, training, and resources. First, soldiers, the bread and butter of any military. Much like the Sino-Indian War, China has numerical superiority, though in India's defense, seeing as China is ranked as having the highest number of active military personnel in the world at 2,035,000, China's military has numerical superiority over literally everyone. With over 500,000 reserve personnel who could be easily called into action in a wartime scenario, China is a force to be reckoned with. India, however, isn't all that far behind, with 1,237,117 active personnel and an impressive 960,000 reserve personnel, putting the difference between their totals in the mere hundred thousands. But here's the big twist. The numbers here only pertain to the Indian Army, which is the ground force branch of the Indian Armed Forces, whose total number of active personnel are 1,444,500, second only to the PLA's total active personnel. However, the overall numbers of reserve personnel for the Indian Armed Forces now dwarfs China's at an astonishing 2.1 million. The Indian Navy boasts 67,252 active personnel and 55,000 reserves. The Indian Air Force has 139,576 active personnel and 140,000 reserves. In contrast to India's three-pronged system, the PLA consists of 5 branches: the Ground Force, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, and the Strategic Assault Force. The Ground Force is the Chinese infantry and land-based operations, with 975,000 active personnel. The PLA Navy has 240,000 active personnel. The Air Force even higher at 398,000 active personnel. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, also known by the pretty funny acronym PLARF, is the branch of the military in charge of the land-based ballistic and nuclear armaments. They have only 100,000 active personnel. And finally, the Strategic Assault Force. This is the newest branch of the PLA, established officially in 2015, dealing with extremely modern forms of warfare, like space and cyber operations. This division is so new that we don't even have an exact number of active personnel, but due to the specialization of the job and the fact that the group is only 5 years old, it's safe to assume that it's likely the smallest branch of the PLA. However, we also have a far wider trend to consider here. The fact that China and India are 2 of the most populous nations on Earth, with populations of 1.393 billion and 1.353 billion respectively as of 2018. In a situation of all-out war over their shared border, if both nations introduced conscription, the numerical differences between their armies would ultimately be nebulous. So, if neither army would have an extreme numerical edge in the case of another conflict, let's zoom in and take a look at the average military service member in each infantry, specifically their training, equipment, and weaponry. Thankfully for India, they've grown to invest in more intensive military training over the years, including joint operations training with the British, US, Japanese, French, and Australian militaries as their involvement in the UN deepened. The Indian military has also consistently invested in modernized primary assault rifle systems for their troops, currently working with a mix of American Sig Sauer 716 assault rifles and an Indo-Russian AK-47-203, a modernization of the famously reliable and hardy AK-47. As of 2018, Indian infantry troops are fitted with SMPP ballistic armor, even capable of withstanding blasts from the steel core rounds fired out of an AK-47. All these factors add up to one formidable individual soldier. China's infantry troops don't have quite the same thing going for them. Modern Chinese military training has been criticized for years for its lack of useful applications in real-life combat scenarios, meaning the average military skills of a Chinese infantryman may leave something to be desired compared to their Indian counterparts. They're formidable in the rifle department with the QBZ-95-1, a reliable bullpup rifle which performs best at long range. However, despite China being one of the world's most prolific exporters of body armor, it hasn't historically fitted its troops with that same standard of protection. The PLA is notorious for its light loadout, often leaving soldiers ill-prepared for taking fire, and giving the Indian infantry troops a huge comparative advantage. However, this may change in the not-too-distant future. According to a report from Global Times, China is investing heavily in updating and modernizing its training system, as well as planning on procuring 1.4 million units of high-quality body armor for the PLA. While this isn't currently a certainty, if these plans do go through, any advantages that the Indian Army may have had on an individual soldier level would essentially evaporate, leaving them dead even once again. But these days, war is far more complex than a large group of armed men running at each other and fighting down to the last one standing. In modern warfare, technology can give militaries the crucial edge they need to secure a victory over the enemy. Since 2008, China and India have ranked second and third, respectively, in global military spending, but the gap between them is still pretty immense. Last year, China spent an astonishing $261 billion on military development, compared to India's far smaller $71.1 billion. This disparity becomes a little more natural when you realize that China's economy is 5 times the size of India's. Let's take a look at how these numbers actually translate into vehicles for their armies, navies, and air forces. While China is generally packing more hardware than India, one exception is in the world of tanks. where India's over 4,200 stands over 1,000 units greater than China's 3,200 plus tanks. However, this doesn't paint the whole picture of China's ground capabilities. If we're looking at the number of armored ground vehicles overall, China's 33,000 dwarfs India's 8,600, giving them considerable ground superiority, bolstered by the fact that they have 10 times more rocket projectors than their Indian counterparts. China also holds dominance over the skies, with 3,210 aircraft compared to India's 2,123. It also has approximately double the fighter and interceptor jets and 507 workable airports compared to India's 346. Once again, sadly for India, this trend continues into the country's navies. In terms of total naval assets, China outnumbers India by 777 to 285. More specifically, it has 74 submarines to India's 16, 36 destroyers to India's 11, and if wars were decided on equipment alone, it's unquestionable that China would take the win here. Of course, while nobody on Earth wants the conflict to escalate to this point for the sake of all human life, we'd be remiss to not return to the fact that China and India are both nuclear nations. If the war ever did become an exchange of nuclear force, who would come out on top? Well, for a number of reasons, China has a clear edge here. Not only did they develop their nuclear capabilities just over a decade earlier than India in 1964, New Delhi wouldn't have its first nuke until 1975, but their nuclear arsenal is also double the size of India's with a far quicker growth rate. China has a stockpile of 320 nuclear warheads, having grown by 40 in the past year. Compare this to India with only 150 nuclear warheads, which grew by a mere 10 in the past year. Both nations can deploy these warheads via the nuclear triad of missiles, submarines, and bombers, and thankfully for the human race, both have a no first strike policy. This means the warheads can only be used in retaliation to another nuclear attack, making it less likely that either country would want to strike first. Of course, if either did, all of us would ultimately lose from the resulting radioactive firefight. But on sheer numbers, China takes the clear win with regard to nuclear capabilities. One final factor worth considering is one that's rarely mentioned in a lot of abstract military planning: allies. While it's easy to think of war purely in terms of enemies, your diplomatic and military friends can also be a make or break factor in determining the outcome of a conflict. While China could largely be working a solo war against India with the exception of perhaps Pakistan, a country with fraught relationships with India to say the least, India itself has been building diplomatic relationships with a number of extremely valuable allies. These include the United States, a country with the highest military spending in the world, who under President Trump have gone cold on relations with China while referring to India as a major defense partner. India has also developed strong diplomatic ties to Japan, France, and Australia through performing a number of joint military drills with all of them. Having these various world powers behind them gives India a serious combat edge over China, providing these allies come to India's side in their time of need. While the US could be India's greatest ally in this speculative war, foreign policy under President Trump has been known to be capricious and unreliable to other allies, such as the Kurdish forces in Syria in 2019. So there's really no way of telling for sure. So back to our big question: who would win in a modern conflict between India and China? Turns out, it's a lot more complex than you may have thought. While a layman might assume that China's apparent numerical and monetary advantages handed an easy win, these advantages can be neutralized by India's stronger troops, who are better equipped, better trained, and more experienced, and its greater network of powerful allies. Then there's the strategic picture, as while the Indian Navy is smaller than the Chinese Navy, India itself is situated on the jugular of Chinese trade, so to speak. Chinese trade ships must pass through the Indian Ocean to reach their destinations. While China may have a larger fleet, it's not very well equipped to conduct operations far from its own shores. With only 2 aircraft carriers with a capacity of about 24 aircraft between them, and one not even being operational yet, any Chinese incursion into the Indian Ocean to protect its trade fleets would be disastrous, as the Chinese task force would be brutally pounded by Indian air and naval power. With China receiving the bulk of its oil from maritime trade routes, a protracted war between the two nations would inevitably cripple the Chinese military and industry both. India would simply have to fight defensively, as the terrain separating India and China is extremely difficult and well suited to defensive warfare. While the Chinese could crush any Indian incursion into China itself, and there'd be few strategic targets to take close to the Indian border anyway, a war between the two nations would inevitably see India the winner, as it slowly strangles Chinese trade to death. Check out American USA versus Chinese soldier.
Wow.
Okay, that's a lot.
From my view, I think these countries should not enter in any
Any
conflict,
conflict.
because first we have seen both technological great advanced, but China looks a little bit
Greater than the other.
than India, but they are both so dangerous in technology. But the thing which India is the best than China is troops. Those young people. So I think this should not happen.
They should not.
They should not enter in any conflict. They should just settle their things on that place which called Himalayas. I think so. Okay. That's all I think. I think there is any addition.
No.
So that's it, man. Okay.
So,
Don't forget to like it, subscribe, and please tell us anything about this.
Yeah.
peace.
See us on the next video.
Yeah.